everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We have a major case that we're going to be covering. We're going to jump live there in that courtroom any second, keeping a careful eye, and let's break it down right now. First, let's just talk about this. We're waiting any second to go live in day 3 of the penalty phase in the Scott Nelson trial out of Florida. After incredible testimony by the defendant where he admitted to abducting and brutally murdering 56-year-old Jennifer Fulford, the jury found Nelson guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, carjacking, and robbery. The state explained that Nelson took Fulford from the home where she worked as an assistant and nanny, and investigators discovered her body 3 days later in a field. Duct tape covering her head and face, her wrists and ankles bound, stab wounds to her back and chest. Horrific, horrific crime. Now that same jury that convicted him, they're going to have to determine what the punishment should be. And yes, the death penalty is on the table. Yesterday, the defense put on witnesses to discuss Nelson's troubling childhood and deficits and impairments in his mental capabilities and cognition. Well, should we believe this? What should we believe? Let's break it all down right now. Joining me from Jacksonville State University, forensic death investigator, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, good morning to you. It's great to see you as always.
Good to see you too, Jesse.
Let's break down what happened yesterday. So the defense, they bring out all these experts to talk about what's going on in the mind of the defendant. We hear from this neuropsychologist. What's your take on it?
Wow, the AFib defense. I don't think I've heard that one before. That's quite compelling. I guess that, in context of what we're talking about, I guess he's saying that in some way that he has neuro impairment as a result of lack of appropriate oxygenation of blood going to his brain. So this is a new one for me. I got to tell you, it's a first. It was a very grim picture that was painted yesterday, Jesse, of this guy's past. I thought that his brother was rather compelling, painting the story of what it was like growing up in that household with a father that's disconnected and is abusive, that has substance abuse issues and these sorts of things. But again, I want to bring this back to Jennifer. I don't know that they have necessarily diminished his actions relative to her and the thought that went into this and the preparedness that he had going on when he brutally attacked her.
Yeah, always in a penalty phase, it's kind of like you have to weigh the victim with the defendant. What happened to the victim? How do her family members move on without her? And then let's also try to understand who the defendant is, how he was brought up, try to understand everything, all the circumstances surrounding this, because at the end of the day, the jury will have to decide if they're going to recommend ending the life of another human being. Now, that's the question. But we didn't just hear from this neuropsychologist, we also heard from a neurologist. Let's hear what he had to say yesterday. All right, Joseph, another witness that's giving something to think about. I mean, are these things to consider that would ultimately result in a person murdering another human being? Is this to blame for what happened to him?
Well, let's think about the deficits that they were talking about, Jesse. They were talking about the inability as a result of these factors impacting him. They're talking about concussive events. They're, again, talking about atrial fib. They never quite say if he has, in fact, had a stroke per se, but they talk about his ability to make decisions and these sorts of things. Wow, but they touched on motor deficit just a moment ago and motor impairment. They never circled back around to that in that clip that I just saw. Isn't it interesting? He seemed to have total and complete motor function when he was wrapping her head, mouth and nose in tape and utilizing a knife to end her life. He was also capable of driving around in a car. I can tell you that the jury is hearing this, Jesse, and they're balancing this. Back to what you said, they have to weigh. They have to weigh these things in their totality. Hey, listen, they know what this guy did. They saw the photographs. They've heard all of the testimony. This stuff is not lost on them.
Yeah, it's a weird position to put the jury in. They've already said he's responsible for the murder of this woman. The question is, basically, do they feel sorry for him? Do they have sympathy for him? Do they feel that based upon everything they're seeing, he doesn't deserve the death penalty? That's a question. It's both a legal and a moral question for every one of those jurors, and you need a unanimous decision in order to recommend the death penalty for that man you see right there. Okay, so there's a sidebar going on right now. Let me bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan to understand this. What could he be testifying to, Joseph? I mean, we've seen this happen before, where people who, are in the corrections facility, they've had interactions with a defendant. What could he be testifying to?
Well, I think that this guy comes from a perspective of giving a very broad view of the prison system. My suspicion is here, because he is an expert on the U.S. Penal system, is that he is going to talk about the trauma that the defendant suffered while he was in prison. Keep in mind, they've reflected on assaults. They talked about rape, all of these things that this guy has gone through while he was in the system already. And, the defendant has also spoke at some length in testimony relative to how he was abandoned, how he was left behind, how he was treated like an animal in these environments. And my suspicion is this is where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, the defendant said it himself about how he is a product of the criminal justice system and how everything has happened to him in prison that you can imagine. What's interesting about that is it doesn't excuse his behavior one way or another, but this is an interesting case that kind of makes you reflect on the criminal justice system. I mean, if you take everything that he says is true and he's put back into society and left on the street, again, doesn't excuse anything that he did by killing an innocent person like Jennifer Fulford. But the question is, does he have a point that this leads to people being put back into society who commit more crimes and like this, who end up being murderers?
I think that violence becomes normalized in these incarcerated environments, and also you couple that with the childhood trauma that they've talked about relative to this. But let's also keep in mind something else, Jesse. There's something called free will. You have a choice to make in your life. He made a lot of choices along the way to get to this point. Right. And you can't just merely, or the courts can't just merely, walk away from that and not address that as well.
Yeah, and listen, the jury didn't like, but by finding him guilty, they didn't like the idea of him just blaming his probation officer for what ultimately happened to Fulford, that it's his probation officer's fault for putting him in that situation, and he was just left to his own devices. So they didn't really like that. We'll see where this testimony goes, because, again, this is a different kind of decision for this jury. They have to decide whether or not they're going to recommend that this man be sentenced to death or not. So let's go back live and we'll learn more. Okay, Joseph, I want to ask you this, and this might be a very unsympathetic, cruel way to explain it, but I am curious. If I'm sitting on that jury and I'm listening to all the terrible things that happen in prison, couldn't I just say, well, wasn't it his fault that he was in prison in the first place, and everything that happened to him, I don't really care?
Yeah, sure you could. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the reality is that the jury, they're normal people. They're just walking about in society. They're sitting there comparing themselves to everything they're hearing about this guy. It's like, well, I've had some hard breaks in my life, but I haven't gone out and just absolutely ripped a woman to shreds. I was able to control myself. Of course, the flip side of that is, we have to look at this from the perspective of, well, was he forced into this by decisions that he made, and also that society forced him into this? And that, I think that's what the defense is trying to argue here. And by extension, not just society, but governmental agencies, with the way they warehouse people and the brutality that goes on there. He's institutionalized at this point. They've used that term before, and that they can't deal. They don't understand boundaries and all these sorts of things. But again, it comes down, and the jury is who's important here, Jesse, as you well know. What it comes down to is this issue of free will. He made a free will decision to do the things that he did on the outside.
Exactly. I mean, and look, not only just killing a woman, killing an innocent woman who had no connection to him whatsoever, that he didn't even know beforehand. That's what makes this such a horrible and tragic case. Joseph, am I hearing this correctly, that Scott Nelson was segregated from other prisoners? He had beefs with other groups, and cooperating with law enforcement, not something you want to do as a prisoner. What do you make of this?
I don't know. There's one word that comes to mind. Remember, prosecution objected just a second ago before he went any further, it's snitch. And that's what it comes down to. I think the world that this guy lived in. But sometimes if you're in a diminished position, information is the only thing you have to leverage yourself with to try to protect yourself. He made an interesting comment, the witness did. He stated that almost 95% of the time that this fellow was incarcerated, he spent in special housing. He said that's particularly interesting and odd.
Yeah, that is a bit of strange. We are learning more details about his prison life. And listen, we heard from the defendant himself when he took the stand that he's been raped in prison. He's had all different kinds of horrible circumstances happen to him in prison. So we're learning more. Let's go back live. All right, so there's still a little bit of delay in court. Joseph, let me ask you this. This is all well and good. My question is, and what we're all waiting to see, is the defendant going to come back on the stand? Is he going to have one last thing to say to this courtroom before the jury ultimately makes their recommendation?
I don't know. There's been a lot of information that's thrown out there, and I I have visions of this guy sitting on a spring in that chair, just wanting, desiring to get back up on the stand and state his case, let everybody know what his opinion is, such as it is, and particularly in light of a lot of this revealing familial information. Now they're going into the gritty details of what prison life is like. He's probably, and I'm superimposing my thoughts on this, he's probably thinking that they are insufficient to the task, perhaps. He seems like he likes to cross swords. So it would be interesting to see if this happens. I think that it'll make for quite compelling viewing. If you will. We were talking about the assaults in prison, and I think that that's something that will probably be addressed here in just a few moments.
Yeah, probably. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll learn more about the life of Scott Nelson. And again, we're waiting to see if the defendant himself will jump back on that stand. Stay tuned.